Hi, everybody. Welcome. And welcome back to many of you. Just looking at the list, I can see that there are lots of familiar names and people who have been following us all the way along. It's really great to see. Welcome back. This is our final talk out of 7. It's been a really great series. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Haley Ross, and I work with the Columbia Mountain Institute, or CMI for short. And I'm one of your hosts today. And I'm joined here with Kendall Benish with the Kootenay Conservation Program, also one of your co-hosts today. And we're here together in what we call the KCP Winter Webinar Series and CMI's CRED Talks together all as one. And I want to tell you a little bit about what we've been doing if you haven't been with us so far. So the series has followed a theme, and that theme has been foundations of resilience, understanding departures from historical ecosystems and adapting for resilient futures. And we welcomed 7 scientists who were drawing on patterns from the past, challenges in the present, and scenarios for the future to explore adapting ecosystems for resilience in the Columbia Basin. This series has been supported by the Columbia Basin Trust. So big thanks to the Trust for helping us get this up and off the ground. And so far in the series, we have sort of delved deeply into large-scale changes on the landscape and in our forests, but we haven't talked a lot about what this means for wildlife. So we're going to do a bit of that today, and we're going to do that with Clayton Lamb. So I'll introduce Clayton in more detail in just a moment. But before I do, importantly, I'd like to do an acknowledgement of the land that where I am and the First Peoples of this place. I'm in Revelstoke, BC, in the homeland of the Sinixt people. And the Shuswap have also stewarded this land for millennia. The Ktunaxa call this valley the land of the chickadee in their creation story, and the Syilx also express strong connections to this place. So what I would like to do now is give you the opportunity to do the same. So please feel free to introduce yourself. Use the chat, open that up, so you can click your chat icon at the bottom of your screen. Tell us who you are, perhaps an organization that you are working with or representing today, and the Indigenous territories that you're zooming in from. It's a fun way to see who's online, and it's a great opportunity to test out the chat because you'll probably be using it later on. So while those roll in, I'm going to just keep going here and tell you a little bit about one of our host organizations, CMI. So who are we? We're a professional development organization. Actually, I'm going to say that a little bit differently. We're a nonprofit organization, and in some ways an association for people who work in applied ecology. And one of the things we do is provide professional development. And those come in a variety of forms. They come in webinars, of course. They come in courses. They come in the form of conferences. And they tackle a variety of topics, including everything from nitty-gritty field-based techniques, statistics courses, or broader, more complex land management conundrums. And we have a lot of resources on our website that are available to you for free. So I encourage you to go and check those out. And they include the recordings from series like this, of course, and proceeding documents from a lot of our larger events, such as conferences. And you can find those at cmiae.org. Okay, I'm going to hand it over to Kendall now.
Thank you, Haley. My name is Kendall Benish, and I'm joining you on behalf of Kootenay Conservation Program, or KCP. KCP's work also occurs in the unceded, ancestral, and traditional territories of the Ktunaxa, Shuswap, Sinixt, and Syilx Okanagan peoples who've lived here and cared for the land, water, and wildlife since time immemorial. KCP is a broad partnership of 85 land and water conservation and stewardship groups, Indigenous nations, government agencies, resource industries, and agricultural producers that work throughout the East and West Kootenays. And our mandate is to coordinate and facilitate conservation efforts on private land and to generate the support and resources needed to maintain this effort, which includes building technical knowledge in webinars like this. So we're very excited to be hosting the webinar series this year with CMI. We're excited to have Clayton here today with our last presentation of the 7 webinars. And we'd like to give an additional thanks to our program sponsors, without whom we really wouldn't be able to support this type of important work. So just a couple final housekeeping details from me, and then we'll get started. So as you've noticed, this webinar is being recorded and it'll be posted to both the CMI and the KCP websites within a week, and you're welcome to share it widely. We ask that you remain muted unless you're asking a question during the Q&A at the end of the talk. And please note that we'll be using the chat function for our Q&A. So you're welcome to add any questions that you have for Clayton into the chat throughout the webinar, but we won't be addressing them till the end of the talk. And also at the end of the talk, I'm going to be posting a link to a feedback survey into the chat. And please just take a couple minutes before you leave today to fill it out, because it really does help us plan for next year. And that's it. Back to you, Haley.
Great. Thanks, Kendall. Okay, so now I have the honor of introducing Clayton Lamb. So Clayton's going to be presenting a talk called Tales of Taking Evidence Through Conservation Action for Two Iconic Mountain Dwellers, the Caribou and Grizzly Bear. And I'd like to just read a quick bio before we begin. So Clayton is a wildlife scientist and he lives in the Elk Valley. He focuses on bringing evidence through to action that supports wildlife and people who coexist with them. Clayton works on wildlife projects across Western North America with First Nations, provincial and federal governments, and with industry. Okay, Clayton, you can take it over. Thanks. You're muted, I think. Yep. Still muted.
How's that?
Yep, you're good.
Despite all of our practice, you can never get it right in the real thing. Okay, well, thanks everybody for taking some time out of your day today to listen to this talk and to for joining some of the previous presentations. I'd like to talk to you about two conservation initiatives, one in northern British Columbia and one in southern British Columbia on two different iconic species in our province. So, I want to talk to you about building resilience through conservation actions to increase endangered species abundance, so that's caribou, and to improve coexistence with large carnivores, which are grizzly bears. So the first one's going to be a conservation project led by two First Nations in central British Columbia that is essentially doing the impossible and doing what nobody else could do at the time, and it was to avert the extirpation of an endangered caribou population that was headed immediately for extirpation. And then a second one is what we're doing in southeast British Columbia to improve coexistence between people and grizzly bears, which is British Columbia's mortality and conflict hotspot in the Elk Valley. Just a quick little bit about me and how I come to this work. So I'm a settler and a wildlife scientist. I have the privilege of living and working in Ktunaxa, the homeland of the Ktunaxa people. And I also work with West Moberly First Nations and Saulteau First Nations on their caribou recovery program, braiding knowledge systems. And, I'm here to basically amplify the work that they do and that we work on together. And, I think it goes without saying that I don't speak for these nations, but I'm here to amplify their efforts and share their successes through my lens. So this is the Klinse-Za story, essentially, at least from the Western science perspective. A few hundred caribou in 1995, declined down to only about 38 animals by 2013. And then West Moberly and Saulteau got involved and a number of different partners. And from 38 in 2013, today there's almost 140. So almost a tripling of this endangered species. And I'm going to share with you how that happened. What's a little different than other parts of British Columbia potentially is that these two First Nations are part of a treaty First Nation, Treaty Number 8, which was signed in the late 1800s. And as part of that treaty, what is legally interpreted as part of the treaty is what was said to the people at the time. And this is a report from the Commissioner for Treaty Number 8 from Winnipeg, Manitoba, back to Ottawa. And the statement to Ottawa was, our chief difficulty was the apprehension that the hunting and fishing privileges were to be curtailed. So the First Nations were concerned that during colonization, they would lose access to the things that they held dearly. And Canada, the commissioner who was speaking for Canada, said they had to solemnly assure them that they would be as free to hunt and fish after the treaty as they would be if they never entered into a treaty. And this is a key line in the commissioner's report because, you know, a century and a half of colonization, and clearly that is no longer being upheld by Canada, and Canada has a legal requirement to uphold that treaty with these nations. And that is sort of where the caribou come into this story. So at the heart of the caribou issue is a landscape that is not working for caribou. Industrial resource extraction has dramatically changed the landscape for caribou and their predators, and those predators' preferred prey, which is not actually caribou. So as we log and open up landscapes, changing old growth forest into young, early sterile stages, which has shrubs and grasses and all the things that elk and moose and deer like to eat, that increases the abundance of those species, which can be good at times. But with those other species comes wolves and cougars and more bears sometimes. And those predators basically spill over and kill caribou at unsustainable levels. And in addition to just the sort of numeric response, just having more predators on the landscape, the way the predators use the landscape is also different due to linear features like roads and pipelines and railways. And those linear features allow predators to basically, especially wolves, to move through the landscape more efficiently and be essentially better hunters. So we've essentially mucked up the predator-prey dynamic that was working for caribou to a point that is no longer working. And when it comes to West Moberly and Saulteau First Nations, caribou were an important part of their diet at times. They were never a primary food source, but they were always there when they needed them. There was always caribou in the mountain, and when tough times hit, there was always caribou to be had. And one of the wishes from an elder was that they wanted to eat caribou before they died, because since 1970, these nations have not been able to hunt caribou. They had to impose a voluntary hunting moratorium across the nations to basically recover caribou. There were so few caribou around, they could no longer exercise their right to hunt these caribou. And as a result, the communities have not been eating or using caribou because the populations were so low. But that, of course, doesn't need to be the fate of those caribou. And a collaborative group of people has been working together to basically rewrite that story. How do we build more caribou? How do we eventually have people harvesting caribou and reconnecting with the landscape and with these animals and with each other out on the land, hunting and being part of it? And I just want to point out that I'm the one that's going to tell you this story, but I'm a very small piece of this story. I help catch these caribou, and I help, with some of the funding and do some of the science, but I'm a very small part of this. The heart of this work is really West Moberly and Saulteau First Nations, Dr. Scott McNay in the top right-hand corner there of Wildlife Infometrics, and a whole team of people that really make this happen. I was up north catching caribou for the maternal pen last week, and there was about 30 of us there. There was helicopter pilots and veterinarians and First Nations, and it's a big group that makes this happen. So when you have these fragile, small populations of caribou that are heading towards extirpation or towards zero caribou, how can we rapidly grow the population? And, I'm going to talk about this from a central British Columbia stance. So this is sort of just north of the Pine Pass or close to Chetwynd or south of Fort St. John type area. But of course, it obviously rings true at home in the Kootenays here, where we have had many populations of caribou become extirpated, and are seeing populations head towards that rapidly, including the central Syilx, which is now the most southern population of caribou in Canada. So at its very basic level, we need more calves. So we can increase the survival of adult females, which is helpful because they make calves. So they're part of the solution. But when you have, say, only 10 adult females left, a very small population, you're not going to grow it without making new caribou. You can work really hard to keep those 10 alive, but if they're not making new caribou, you'll just always have 10, and then eventually they will get old and die. So it's this combined effort of keeping those 10 alive to produce calves, and which can become new adult females and new moms, and allowing those calves to survive. So that's important for caribou because the calves have a very low survival rate in the first 6 weeks of life. So sometimes up to half of those calves can die in the first 6 weeks of life, especially in these really disturbed landscapes where we have wolves and cougars and grizzly bears and wolverine and all the things that like to eat caribou. And, historically that might not have been a big problem. One, because there are likely fewer predators, and two, there was probably more caribou. So if there was, say 3 or 4 grizzly bears wandering around the landscape and they each ate a few caribou, it wasn't a big deal. That was how that world worked. But if there was 1,000 caribou, it didn't really matter. But when there's only 9 calves being produced and 3 died of grizzly bears and 4 died of wolves, all of a sudden it can be very hard to sustain a population. So in 2013, West Moberly and Saulteau First Nations got involved. Chief Roland Wilson is the chief of West Moberly First Nations, and this quote is his up at the top. And it really speaks to the heart of this initiative, in that it was an all-out effort and they didn't go into it half-hearted. And that's really the secret to caribou recovery and probably a lot of other issues that we're dealing with. The methods that they employed were basically threefold. What was done was to improve calf survival by putting caribou in a maternal pen, which means basically keeping caribou safe during a period from March until they have their calves in May, and then allowing those calves to grow up until they're about 6 weeks old, sometime in July or August, and then releasing them back into the landscape. So we basically capture caribou, adult females, bring them into this maternity pen, which is about 30 acres, and Indigenous guardians live with them up at elevation year round. And then Star on the right is one of those guardians that looks after those caribou. Another piece was reducing the abundance of wolves on the landscape. So it was very clear that the density of wolves was far too high to sustain these caribou, and they were unequivocally heading to zero without immediate action. So in 2013, there was an Indigenous-led trapping effort to reduce wolves. And then by 2017, the province had an aerial program, and the nations still continued to support from the ground. And while this was all happening, there were negotiations to basically try to help these caribou's habitat. And of course, that underlies all of this. There's a habitat problem that is not working for these caribou, but there's a major time lag in these habitat solutions. So even if we could protect the habitat today, or even restore it all, so put trees in there, it doesn't immediately become caribou habitat. I mean, caribou habitat is old growth, lichen and all the things that don't look like regenerating clear cuts. So really, these caribou need support in the interim while one, those negotiations were being done, and then two, while restoration not only is being done, but while those trees and what is restored actually becomes ecologically meaningful to those caribou. So this is a female caribou with a calf. So this is the heart of the maternity pen. So the goal is to bring in somewhere between 10 and 20 adult females every year, and they're fed lichen in the beginning because that's what they naturally eat, and transition to a caribou specific pellet basically that was developed in a zoo. And then in May and June they have their calves, and almost every caribou is pregnant that comes into the pen. So pregnancy is not really an issue, and it's not in the wild either. But what we see is that a number of the caribou by kind of April, if they're not in the maternity pen, are just gone. There's all these females that don't have a calf at heel anymore. And what the pen does is it essentially doubles the survival of these calves, and it does actually give the moms a little bit of a boost too. So that's something we're still looking into, whether it's food, because they are getting fed in the pen, or if it's just that they're being kept safe from predators. But we see bumps in adult female survival, modest bumps, and a doubling of calf survival. And the other one is wolf reductions, as we talked about. So reducing the density of wolves to more of a natural type density that these caribou would have had historically, and what basically would allow them to grow on this landscape. And that's a combined effort between the two First Nations and the province. So those two, we call them short-term or interim efforts, have taken this population from declining from hundreds of animals down to 38, and has now, once these actions were implemented, has nearly tripled or has over tripled the population to 134 today. And I mean, I think that's quite significant. I mean, I can't think of any other species or conservation effort in British Columbia that has had that kind of success in the last decade, for sure. And it really speaks to the collaborative nature of this effort. So First Nations, provincial, federal governments, independent scientists, conservation organizations, industry is a part of this as well. And everybody really came to the table for these caribou. And it's not as if this is it's not over. It's an interim effort, and it's still ongoing in that the habitat restoration is coming online right now, and I'll talk about that in a second. But there's more than just caribou here. I mean, I think one important lesson for me with working with the nations is, I was classically trained as a Western scientist. We learned to sort of take the emotion and feeling and the human side out of everything, and apply the scientific method and take our person out of it. And I think the nations always drive home just that caribou are important to people. And I was always taught to write funding agreements to say that this species is important to the ecosystem and ecosystem services, and why. And it's okay if critters are just important to people. And I think that this quote by Julian Napoleon, who was also a caribou guardian of the pen, really sums it up. And Julian says that his work comes down to his philosophy around food. For the moose and caribou to thrive, we need to continue honoring them. Eating them is a part of that. There's no way to express deeper gratitude to an animal than when it offers itself to you and you bring it home and share it with the people you love. And, I think it also helps to decolonize conservation a little bit. Like, the end goal here is to create a harvestable surplus of caribou, essentially. So there's enough caribou to reestablish a culturally meaningful hunt of caribou. And so, the end success of increasing these caribou will be a harvest by the two nations. So beyond these interim recovery actions, something had to be done for this landscape, because clearly that landscape was not working for caribou. And a historic partnership agreement between 4 governments, so 2 being West Moberly First Nations and Saulteau First Nations, and then the province of British Columbia and Canada, was signed in February of 2021. And this partnership agreement essentially secures a chunk of land that is 50% larger than Banff National Park for caribou. So, a very significant piece of land to protect caribou habitat. A lot of the area within this protected area is already disturbed. So it's not as if that legal protection all of a sudden helps these caribou. Like the day it was signed, the caribou didn't notice per se, but there will be less disturbance going forward, or there'll be essentially none, because the industry has been, industry tenures have been removed from the majority of that landscape. And importantly, any restoration that is done on that landscape is now secured. So in other ranges, we have this issue where we could spend $1 million restoring a road, and then in the adjacent valley, or even worse, across the river in the same valley, a road could be punched in to access timber. And in this case, we won't see that because there is this layer of protection on the landscape. And as we chip away at restoration, we won't be simultaneously undoing it elsewhere. So on the caribou front, basically the next decade is going to dictate the future for a lot of these caribou herds. So, either we will act decisively to avert their extirpation and increase them in the short term and get meaningful habitat restoration figured out and started, or, a number of the populations or subpopulations of caribou within British Columbia will continue to be extirpated at alarming rates as they have been in the past. And I think that the Klinse-Za story does tell us that that future is ours to decide. I mean, had nobody, especially the two nations, not stood up to save those caribou, they almost certainly would have been one of the 14 extirpated herds of caribou in British Columbia. But now they are one of the conservation success stories for caribou. So, I think collectively, as we prioritize where we want to spend our time and our money, if there are caribou herds or other species, sheep herds or whatever folks want to work on, I mean, I think the future is ours to decide, and species can be recovered if we get after it together. So that's the quick caribou story, and we'll shift to grizzly bears, who can eat caribou at times. They don't down here in Southeast BC because there hasn't been a caribou seen here since the late 60s, at least on the southeast side, east of the Trench in the Rockies. And, this is a bit of a different situation in that we're not looking to bolster abundance, or that grizzly bears are not an endangered species in this exact population. They are an important and valued and iconic species, but they can be a challenge to live with. Grizzly bears are great and they're icons of wilderness, but when you live in a valley that has 3 times the density of grizzly bears in Banff National Park, all of a sudden it can be a challenging life to be both a bear and a person in this landscape. So this is about trying to figure out how to make the landscape work better for both those parties, bears and people. I always like to flash this up and remind people, even though there are times it feels like either there's too many bears or bears are a major conservation concern in other places, we do know this for sure about grizzly bears, that they used to range all the way to Manitoba, almost to Ontario, all the way down to Mexico, and all the way through California. And what used to be caribou habitat was, that's the problem with doing 2 species in one talk. What used to be grizzly bear habitat was probably pretty flat, chill country. It could have been bison habitat, and it's not the mountainous, rugged landscape that we think of today. But of course, that bison habitat turned into the prairies that we know today, and is heavily industrialized by agriculture. So the current distribution is where we think of bears in the kind of rugged mountains of BC and Alberta and north. And on the fringes of those mountains are these kind of coexistence landscapes where it's not 100% secure. It's not this rugged mountain landscape. It is somewhere in the middle. It is, rugged and mountainous and productive, but it's also busy. It's either, that's the town of Fernie in the left there, southwest Alberta on the top right, where bears are rapidly expanding into, or just, a busy working landscape with quads and all sorts of other things on it, like the bottom right there. And in Southeast BC, we see all of that and more. We see, we have a ski town, mountain biking, hunting, coal mining, and all sorts of different things going on. And again, when you have 3 times the bears that Banff, 3 times the density of bears that Banff National Park has, and a lot of cities and, maybe moderate to low attractant management, these are just some of the things that you see. Grizzly bears walking down main streets, some cute things like looking into the pool. But, overall, having grizzly bears in town is not a good thing for bears or people. A bunch of these were from Elkford, which is especially not a good place because half the town stands out in front of their yards to catch a bus to to go to tech every morning. And as bears are bouncing around between houses and all these people are standing outside their house, it's not a good situation for anybody. And, you know, the reality is that bears often lose in these situations. And, you know, this is just an example of sort of what the life and death of a bear looks like in the valley. So on the top left is a healthy bear up the fording, life's going good. But the other photos are the reality of grizzly bears in the Elk Valley as well. So the top middle there is a grizzly bear and her 3 cubs that were run over by a train in Elko. Top right is a collared grizzly bear dead with 3 pigs that broke into an electric fence that was not armed in Fernie and started killing pigs. Bottom left is a bear hit on the highway by Hosmer. And the bottom right is, you know, some of the consequences that people face because of this. So this is a chicken coop with the door ripped clean off of it, and you can see the bear's prints all over the front there. So, you know, it's a challenging landscape for bears and people as well, despite the density of both. So what's killing bears in the Elk Valley? So we initiated a long-term collaring project here. We've collared 65 grizzly bears since 2016 and continuing. And half of the mortalities are from conflicts with people, either out in the bush or at their residences due to unsecured attractants. The other half, or most of it, 45% of it, is road and railway. So either hit on the highway or hit by the train, which is a significant split. And then, you know, only 1 in 20 bears that dies, only 5% is due to anything else or natural causes. So it's pretty rare for a bear to die, either not due to a conflict or due to being hit. So a little plot here, because I build plots for a living. So no talk of mine goes without a little bit of science in there. This is a comparison of survival for adults on the left, subadults on the right, and both sexes, female and male by color, for all the good demographic data that we have for grizzly bears across North America. And what I want to draw you to is the Elk Valley, which is at the top. And what we see is that adult survival, so the survival of bears that are basically older than 6 years old, is pretty good, no problem. Even in the Elk Valley with all these people and all the stuff going on, it's very high. But subadult is the worst in North America. So what we have is this basically challenge of young bears learning to live in this landscape. And that's essentially what we're going to try to help solve. So most of the conflict, most of the mortality, and most of the issues are these young bears. And, you know, it's obviously not working for those young bears, and it's not working for people of the valley. And the Elk Valley, it often gets an exceptional level of interest and funding and research, but it also is exceptional in general, in that it has 10 to 100 times more conflict and road and rail deaths than any other place that grizzly bears exist in British Columbia. So, you know, the challenges are very real here and they are exceptional. So it's not good news for the Elk Valley, but it does mean this isn't actually a widespread issue, and we can probably solve it here if we, again, you know, get after it. And the heart of the issue for the bears is this sort of trifecta of problems. It is that there's a bunch of wild habitat that is good for bears all around. And there's good food in there, so it produces abundant grizzly bears. Those are huckleberries in the top right. But interspersed between these productive areas are all these risky things. Basically, linear human settlements in Fernie and Elko and Sparwood and Elkford. And in there are trains and cars and apple trees and all kinds of challenges. And so that is sort of the dynamic that causes us issues. And I mean, you might wonder, how do the adult females survive so well and the subadults don't? And it largely comes down to being nocturnal. So if you drive through Banff, not today because bears are hibernating, but in a couple months, you'll probably see a grizzly bear on average. whereas you almost never see a bear here. And that is because our grizzly bears are almost strictly nocturnal, and at least the ones that live long, which are the adult females. And so just to give you an example, these are some GPS relocations for this one adult female. She had 2 cubs, and this is the town of Hosmer and Fernie. And, you know, she's all over town, and she never received a single complaint. Whereas a sub-adult out there in the middle of the day probably would have had 30 or 40 complaints and might have ended up dead. So that's really the strategy that's working for them at the moment. And we looked at this across basically all the collared bears across British Columbia, which is more than 500, and basically looked at what percent they were nocturnal. So, you know, 100% would be you only use night, and 0% would be you only use the day. And the human influence index on the right, which is, you know, basically the more human impacted the area is. So the flathead or somewhere wild would be on the left, and the middle of a city would be on the right. And there's a missing triangle here. And essentially they're an adult female that is in a busy human dominated area doesn't exist, that is not nocturnal. The only females within these busy human places are all nocturnal. There wasn't a single data point in that bottom right corner. But, you know, with all of this high mortality, it creates a situation where these bears essentially can't maintain themselves. So there's more mortality. All these young bears are dying faster than adult females can produce them. And that creates this strange situation where it would appear the population should just decline down to 0 then, because it's not sustainable. But because there's these wilder areas of the Flathead and Alberta and even Montana and the Bull River, these sort of human-dominated populations are then kind of sustained by immigration from elsewhere. So even though they can't, you know, survive their young all the way to being sub-adults and through to being adults in an efficient manner, the ones that are lost are basically offset by immigrants from elsewhere. So an adult female in the backcountry basically builds a young, it grows up, it disperses, and it ends up in the Elk Valley. And we've seen that a number of times. So this is a map with the Fernies here, Cranbrooks over here, and I'll just kind of zoom in and show you a couple examples. So the border there is America. So this is a bear that came out of Idaho and actually dispersed into the trench basically by Jaffrey, and, you know, moved about 80 kilometers from its natal range and ended up dying, but did live there for a while. These 2 bears came from Alberta, from Ktunaxa country, and moved about 90 kilometers south down to Elkford. So, you know, what we're seeing is that the impacts locally have these really widespread effects. We're basically pulling bears from different jurisdictions commonly to keep the population of bears stable here. And what that looks like in a kind of numeric sense is the orange bar is what we're seeing in real time, that if we count the bears, there's the same number of bears year over year, and this is true back to like 2006. There's always lots of bears. There's about 100 bears in the Elk Valley. But if we use the collar data, they should decline down to 0 quite quickly. And that difference is made up by the immigrants. So it's about 7 bears a year are immigrating into the Elk Valley. And that's essentially what we need to offset. We need to do enough so that 7 fewer bears die a year, so that this population is not dependent on immigration. I'm going to whip through a couple things that we're doing here and kind of give you a taste of what we're working on. So a few things. One is, obviously, we need to look after those wilderness areas. They are what is supporting this source sink or immigration type situation. And so one initiative was to make sure that those huckleberry patches that are producing strong, fat females and abundant cubs are protected. And there was a situation where commercial pickers were coming from outside the province and basically raking the huckleberry bushes with basically a tool that was damaging the bushes or even ripping them out of the ground and picking them at home later. So we mapped where the huckleberry was, and we worked with the province of BC to basically restrict huckleberry harvesting for any commercial enterprise. So you can still go pick them for your pies and stuff like that, but nothing large scale, to leave a little bit more for the bears. Next one's highway mitigation. Some apologies for the photo, but also that's the reality out there. You know, this is what happens when a vehicle strikes a bear or any other kind of animal, which is, you know, even more common, elk or deer or sheep. And so in 2019, we developed a plan for the province, basically where the priority areas were to work on highway mitigations, where you could basically build crossing structures, fence the area, and, you know, exclude roadkill from the highway and allow them to move over these crossing structures and overall reduce roadkill. And in 2020, we basically started breaking ground on a project with Ministry of Forests, Ministry of Transportation, and many other partners. And this is the plan at the moment. So there are 10 crossing structures planned. Some of them are existing bridges that'll be retrofitted. One will be a purpose-built overpass, and 2 will be purpose-built underpasses in other places. And it'll be fenced together. So about 27 kilometers of fencing. And we've finished the first 2 kilometers of fencing this fall, with about 3 or 4 more kilometers about to happen next year. So it's going to move forward in phases. Here's a look at that fence near the Corbin Junction. So this is a jump out for wildlife that do get stuck on the wrong side of the fence and one of the underpasses, and my pickup, which is not pertinent. Here's some animals using those underpasses after it was fenced. So, you know, good news, whole herds of elk, bull elk, whitetail, no bears yet because it was fenced in November. So they were all going to bed, but I suspect in the spring we'll have some photos to share there. And also working with the Ministry of Transport to think of highways for their new builds. So this is a bridge between Fernie and the ski hill at Lizard Creek. And part of the design was to build some paths under this bridge to consider wildlife. Eventually it should be fenced. I mean, a crossing structure without fencing is not all that helpful for animals, but that's so, even without fencing, there's been a number of animals that started using this underpass as is. So here's a family of deer that seems to use this all the time, almost daily. And here's a grizzly bear that also found it to be a useful way to get under the highway instead of over and across. Another piece is trying to reduce the attraction of human foods to bears, and, you know, basically trying to reduce the overlap, the amount of time that bears spend near people or near other risky things like the highway or the railway. And one issue that we found using the colors was all these bears were going to these gravel pits, and, you know, there's not much to eat in a gravel pit, as you should know. But when we went there, it was loaded with roadkill. Essentially, it was where roadkill was being dumped, and legally, the roadkill had to be buried within, I think, 48 hours. But basically, grizzly bears were dragging it off before folks even had the chance to bury it. So it was becoming sort of this bear feeding ground and attracting bears near the highway, near towns, and near a rest stop that was right across from this disposal site. So this is, you know, just a quick look at, I mean, not a bad life per se. Like, this bear is chowing down on an elk, and, you know, there was readily available meat. But in the same breath, there was times where there wasn't a roadkill brought for a week. So these bears became dependent on this food, but it wasn't consistent. And so it was possibly, you know, when it didn't come, they'd go to town and get into trouble. And in general, it was just bringing them closer to the highway. We had a number of bears killed on the highway and the railway right adjacent to this site. So we worked with the Ministry of Transport to build what we now affectionately call the bear bunkers. So this is basically where roadkill goes now. This is an Elko. And, you know, we're now actually static composting all of the roadkill. And so this is a fully electrified roadkill jail, essentially, that keeps bears out. There's an electric gate on the front, and the whole top of it is electrified. So what we saw was, on the left was the before situation. So it was how many minutes a day were bears spending at the these carcass pits. So basically, before we did anything, bears and a few coyotes and gray wolves were spending over an hour a day at these carcass pits. No surprise, there's a lot of food there. And now, after less than 6 seconds a day. So basically the odd animal walks up to the fence, looks around, and then gives up. And I think that'll get less and less as time goes on. So huge effect size. Here's a bear coming up to the electrified gate and getting a little shock and then never coming back. And he's gone. So, this was a collared bear. We can confirm he never came back. This is the same electric fencing you use for livestock and horses and things like that. So it's not an extra sharp shock by any means. It's just the standard electric fence. It just surprises the animals. So, there's a few projects that we're working on with different agencies across the Elk Valley. But the other one is trying to deal with these, the other 50% of conflicts that happen on private land, basically in rural residences. And so we have two programs. One is a cost-shared electric fencing program. This is in collaboration with Jillian Sanders and other funders from Y2Y and from HCTF. And basically the goal here is to support people that would like to put up electric fence but need some financial support and also technical support. So Jillian provides that professional support. She's installed thousands of electric fences, and I provide a portion, up to half of the cost of that electric fence, so that people can get those out around their chickens or around their bees or around their unpicked fruit trees. So this is a really effective means. We keep dozens of grizzly bears out of these roadkill pits, which are by far much more attractive than anything you have on your own property. So electric fence on a rural residence is very effective when maintained appropriately, because you don't want wet grass and things to touch it, or else it'll ground out. And then the last one is cost-shared fruit tree removal and replacement. So fruit trees can be important to people because they, maybe eat the fruit or make pies or enjoy them in their front yard. And there's a lot of people that pick their fruit trees at a good time before they're ripe. And those aren't really the trees that we're concerned about. There's another portion of the trees that are not picked for many reasons. They could be that people used to pick them and now they have aged and they're elderly and they're no longer able to pick them, or they could be out of town during that time, or whatever it is, or they just may not want to pick it. And so there's a portion of people that actually want to get rid of their tree, and a portion of those people that want to get rid of it either want it totally gone and don't even want a tree, or they actually still like having a tree. They want shade, or they want the beautiful blossoms or the beautiful colors. So we're running a cost-shared fruit tree removal and/or replacement program. And there's these really nice alternatives that don't bear fruit but have beautiful spring blossoms, like the one on the left, and even great fall colors, like the one on the right. And they don't come with a grizzly bear in the middle, like the one in the middle, an unpicked crabapple tree. So we haven't necessarily taken these to scale yet. We're kind of at the trial stage. We do maybe 10 or 20 trees a year and a handful of fences. But I think that's the next step, is try to scale this up and kind of make that meaningful impact at the population level. So those are our tales for the two species. And I just want to thank everybody that's come to the table for caribou and for grizzly bears, and all the funders that make this happen.
Great. Thanks so much, Clayton. If everybody was unmuted, you'd hear a bit of applause right now, I'm sure. Okay, everybody, this is the point at which we get to ask questions. So just a recap, or for those folks who maybe were coming in late, we invite you to put your question into the chat. I'm going to do my best to relay that question to Clayton, and we'll run through as many as we can get to. So we've got about 10 minutes, which is great. There are some questions that have come in already, Clayton. So I'm just going to start with first question, which we talked about earlier, and that was a curiosity about what are some of the ways that we could reduce grizzly bear or other wildlife collisions on the railway tracks?
Yeah, so if you can fence it and build an overpass, it works just as well as it would on a highway. The challenge is that that become costly, of course, and it only really works if the highway and the railway are close together, and you can kind of couple them in the same fence and the same overpass, which is true in some cases, but it's not in other places. And so one thing that I would really like to try in the Elk Valley is it's called basically an early warning detection system that has been proven to be effective in Banff, but never taken again to scale. And basically, as the train's coming, it puts off some alarms, and it can get animals off the track just like 5 or 10 seconds early, and not allow them to be surprised by the train, which basically makes they get scared and they run away from the train, and then the train catches up with them and then runs them over. So I think that'd be a cost-effective solution, but we just need to sort of a little bit of funding to get it trialed. It's a good spot to try it here because we have 42% of all the railway collisions in British Columbia happen in the Elk Valley for grizzly bears.
That's just wild. Okay, thanks for that. Okay, so I should say to everybody that if I am mispronouncing something in your question, or you want to add a clarification, or you prefer to relay, ask it yourself, just let us know. You can unmute yourself and speak. So that is welcome, just so you know. Okay, so we have a question here from Thomas. And he says, with lots of talk of significantly increasing prescribed fire and increasing wildfire frequency with climate change, how might this impact caribou? Of course, this really ties into some of our earlier talks.
Yeah, wildfire is going to be a challenge for caribou for sure, especially given a century of excluding fire from the landscape. Now, when fires are burning, they're burning big and hot, and in some cases, they will create more moose and more deer and more elk, which is exactly what caribou habitat does not want. So, I think it will be a challenge. And we're actually seeing that in Klinse-Za. Like a quarter of Klinse-Za was burned in the last 10 years. So it doesn't mean we can't recover those caribou. Like I say, we tripled them despite that. But when it comes to sort of taking your hands off and not reducing wolves, it's going to be a big challenge, the amount of fire on the landscape.
Okay, thanks, Clayton. Question here from Amanda, something I was curious about too, actually. Are the recreational tenures also removed in addition to the industrial tenures? So that's talking about that new protected area you were discussing.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I know. I guess I don't think the guide outfitters are out of there, which is another type of tenure. I'm not sure. There's not like big levels of heli skiing or that kind of thing. It's not deep POW up there in the Peace group. It's wind scoured ridges and lots of wind slabs. So I'm not sure actually, but the current recreational impacts are not major up there either.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Interesting. Okay, thanks. Question from Carla. Are other species of bears a problem? Presumably black bears.
Like in general or for caribou?
Well, this question came up when you were speaking about bears, but Carla, maybe unmute yourself and add a clarifying comment. Let's assume black bears in general.
Can you hear me?
Oh, we can hear you.
Yeah. Yeah, I was wondering if it was a problem for the caribou, the other species of bears other than the grizz.
Yeah, black bears also kill caribou calves for sure. It seems to be worse in kind of the boreal landscapes where there's more black bears. Where there's grizzly bears, black bears are fewer, and they can often get pushed out of the best habitats by grizzly bears. So we do see some black bear predation, but it's mostly due to grizzly bears. But there's other caribou herds that are pretty heavily impacted by black bears at times.
Okay, thanks. And thanks for the clarification, Carla. Okay, interesting question from Gary. Do you know how many subadult bear deaths are caused by dominant boars that will kill younger bears and chase them out of their territory? Could overpopulation in certain areas be causing this immigration to less populated areas due to more adult or dominant boars?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we don't know how many of the youngest bears, like basically between birth and 2 years old, while they're with mom, die. They basically, we can't collar them. They're too small, and it's not sort of safe to put a collar on them. So we fly those cubs basically with their mom. We say, like, how many did you have in when you emerge from your den right away, so those small little cubs, then we follow them year over year. The next year we check in and say, how many of those, say 2 cubs that you had, do you still have? And check again the second year. But we don't know why they disappear. So that could be definitely due to boars killing those cubs. And that's well documented in grizzly bears, where males will kill cubs to put that female back into estrus so that they can sire the cubs instead of somebody else. For us on the subadult survival thing, like I guess I'm talking about 3-year-old to 6-year-old bears that we can collar. And of those, as far as we know, none were killed by dominant boars. They were all killed in conflict and by the road and the rail. But we are probably losing some bears due to predation by large males. And yeah, I think the immigration is undoubtedly partly due to having a bunch of bears in the backcountry. The more bears you have back there, the more sort of pressure there is for them to disperse outwards. So yeah, I think you're right, Gary.
Okay, thanks. So we have 2 questions from Dennis. I'm just going to ask the first one, and then we'll come back to the other. So has there been any correlation between grizzly bear occurrence in urban areas to seasonal influences? So for example, fruit on trees, spring shortly after hibernation, etc.
Yeah, both those. So the majority of the conflict happens in the spring as soon as they emerge. And then actually, I should say the majority of the conflict happens in both those times together. And then, part of it happens in the spring, and then the majority of it happens in the fall, right? When bears, there's 2 things that are happening in the fall, or maybe more. The bears are rapidly trying to put on fat, and they actually metabolically and physiologically change, where they then start metabolizing their food in a different way to put on fat. And they're really hungry for this high density, high caloric density food that is, high in sugars and high in fat. And, obviously an apple tree is all of those things. Like if you're a bear out trying to eat wild huckleberries, which are amazing, but, there's just individual berries. And when you get to an apple tree, like a human modified, like genetically modified apple tree, there are tens of thousands of calories on there. And it's really good for a bear that's trying to get a lot of sugar. So we see a lot of conflicts in the fall because of that. There's also hunting going on, and there's gut piles all over the place. And it's a good time where there's both a lot of human food and a bear's need for a lot of food. So they go together and do create a perfect storm of literally chaos at times. There can be a lot of conflicts going on in the fall in the Elk Valley.
Yeah, I can imagine. Okay, next question, same from Dennis. Has there been any consideration to moving carcasses away from the road rail areas to still provide that food source, similar to what Kevin Van Tingham did on the east slopes of the Rockies near Waterton?
Yeah, so we've thought of that, and some of those Alberta programs have been stopped actually since. And what they found out was, even though it seems to make sense in principle, the carcasses end up being just for logistic purposes. They drop them in kind of a few places or one place up in the mountains, and those carcasses then get basically dominated by one big male. So it helps one bear, but it's not helping all the bears, and not even really the bears that we don't want to not help the males, but it's really the females and the young that are kind of more important. And the other one is sort of this liability piece, at least on the sort of public land, is that if, say, the highway contractor is just going to drive down random Forest Service roads and drop them kind of helter-skelter, if somebody gets attacked over one of those carcasses, like who's responsible for that? Because I mean, we have numerous grizzly bear attacks in the valley over kind of attractants. So I think there's some concern over that. It is a shame that that food doesn't kind of make it to bears, but in the same breath, that food could just be artificially inflating the abundance of bears in the valley, and we're not necessarily looking for that.
Right. Yeah. I see your point. Okay. Question from Stephanie. It's a pretty big one. What was the process like to identify the best recovery actions for the caribou herd and determine numbers, sources, timelines, etc., for the breeding program? So for example, population modeling, other methods.
All of the above. It was a combined effort between the two First Nations, West Moberly and Saulteau First Nations, and technical experts, which was Dr. Scott McNay of Wildlife Infometrics. And they basically co-produced a recovery plan for those caribou, which kind of braided the two knowledge systems. So, there's no real traditional knowledge analog to picking up a caribou in a helicopter and moving it to a maternal pen, as you can imagine. That's pretty kind of squarely in the Western science state. But there's all these other pieces, like how many caribou did there used to be? What could the population target be? And just generally, why are these caribou important? And in which way would they like to recover them? Because there's many different options. And so those kind of two groups came together and created this plan that involved the reduction of predators and the maternal penning. And there was these kind of scenarios, like the do nothing scenario versus doing one or the other or both. And yeah, that's a report that can be viewed by anybody.
Okay, that's great. Thanks. Okay, I am just realizing that it's 1:02. So we're gonna have to cut off the questions. I'm sorry, everybody, and move on to a couple other small things here. Clayton, thank you so much. Thanks for taking the time to create this talk for us, for taking the time to share your knowledge and answering questions and everything that goes along with that. If folks have questions that you want to share with Clayton, you can send those to me. If they're a burning question, I can forward that to Clayton, and if he has time, which we know that he's probably quite busy, he'll get back to you, I'm sure. Okay, so I am just going to get formal for a moment. I'm going to share my screen. There we go. All good? Yep. Okay, so at this point, not only do I want to say thank you to Clayton, I want to say thank you to all the speakers in our series. It was fabulous. Thanks also to all of you who've been attending, engaging, asking your excellent questions. It's been fantastic. We also, of course, want to thank our sponsors. So thanks again to CBT. Thanks again to our partnership with KCP and all of their core funders. Yeah, just a big thanks all around. We couldn't do this without you. Okay, and now I just want to zip back a second and say that we have a survey, and in that survey, it should be in the chat already. Yep, it is. Thank you. This is just to give us some feedback. It's super helpful for our planning for future years. It's really helpful to help identify what sort of themes that you might like us to tackle in the future. It helps us to report to our funders, of course, which is also important for the sustainability of our work moving forward. Yeah, so thanks from me. Kendall, would you like to say anything from KCP, or did I capture it?
I think you captured it all, but just another big thanks to everybody who participated this year and attended a webinar. Thanks to CMI. It was such a great experience hosting with you and tapping into your network as well. And we look forward to planning another season next year.
Okay, fantastic. All right. Thanks, everybody. I'll turn my camera and audio off, and we'll just leave that survey link up in the chat for a moment, and then we'll shut it down. Thanks, everybody. Have a good afternoon. Enjoy the sun. I think most of us are in sun today.